I'm really grateful that you asked me to be here. And thanks for you guys making some time to be here, because it's never a bad time to talk about mental health, but especially in May. I love that so many people are more intentional about it because it is Mental Health Awareness Month. So my name's Kaleb Stoppel, and today I'm showing up as a financial advisor, a former educator and school administrator, a father, a husband, and a survivor of a school shooting. And then therefore also someone that works through trauma, specifically, some PTS and anxiety and depression. And so why I talk about what I've gone through and also where I'm at today is because we each have our own story. And we have lots of stories. I mean, that's what life is all about. Stories and life moving forward, whether quickly, whether slowly, whether painfully until it becomes Friday and the Saturday. But that's life, and that's what we're all living. And that's why I'm honored to be here, is the hope that I can tell my story in a way that not only frames a pretty unique incident that fortunately not many have to go through, but also share how I'm trying to live out my own healing and my recovery in a way that can help others. Because selfishly, the things that I do, whether it's writing my book, whether it's talking like this, it really is part of my own healing. But it's also my hope that there may be one or two things that I mentioned that might resonate in your own life. Maybe that's professional, maybe that's personal, but the more we all begin to feel more comfortable sharing stories, some that steer in the way of mental health and emotions and feelings, things that sometimes in life people aren't really comfortable about sharing because we do have, unfortunately, some stigmas tied to mental health. I hope that I can be one of those advocates that just helps us move along, even if it's just 1 inch, becoming others that can be advocates as well. So we all know life moves fast. Whether you have children, whether you have a busy job, whether you have things that you work through on a daily. We all know that life gets crazy no matter what season. But, here's kind of the crazy thing, and this is what we're here to talk about today, kind of a focus on professionals, people that have jobs, and kind of thinking about, well, how the heck do I, be the best I can and give my all to my job because I care about it without losing myself in the process. And so the thing is, the conundrum is we get really good and we feel really good about being successful, whether it's a love language thing of a boss or a colleague telling you did a good job, or whether you get that intrinsic motivation from being able to serve your clients well, whether it's making good sales, or whether it's just being able to go home at the end of the day and being like, phew, I earned that paycheck today, and I'm proud of what I do and what I can bring home for myself or my family. But somewhere along the line, talking about myself now, I stopped checking in on how I was doing. And I think, and as I put this into context, I spent 15 years in education. That's what I got my degree in coming out of undergrad. That's eventually what I got my doctorate in. My parents were both educators. My dad was also, in fact, my elementary principal growing up. And so that was super awkward when I did get in trouble because I was not perfect. I sure got it both ways at school and then at home. But I cared a lot about what I did. And I still care a lot about education. I love the schools that my kids go to school. I still support schools. Teachers need our support now more than ever. But at some point along the way, I feel like I got good at the job, but I put myself in the rearview mirror. And we can sustain that for a while, but eventually the floor is going to come out from under us. And so before everything changed for me, I apologize if I'm kind of in your way over here. Before everything changed for me, this is who I was. And some of these things are still who I am. I was a school leader, a husband, a father. But I put this up here because these pictures are some of my favorites from that time of life. But if you'll notice, all 3 of the 4 are taken in the school. One in the top right is in my office. The bottom one is in my office. The other one is on a Sunday. when the kids they're 9 and 11 now, so this was a few years ago, but on Sundays, our kind of normal practice, which I see now is maybe not super healthy, because maybe, people shouldn't work on Sundays, but maybe not, I didn't really know that. But we would go to church, and then we would drive separately. I would go up to school, work 2 or 3 hours. The boys and my wife would come up. They're wearing their helmets because they'd bring their little scooters up or bicycles and just rip up and down the hallways in the gym. And then a family picture of the Chiefs. So this was me. This was my life. And honestly, I loved it. Okay, I loved that I was able to provide for my family by working hard at school. I loved that I was able to care for people at school, serve, whether it was having crucial conversations with kids who made bad choices or celebrating teams on the field or working with teachers. I just absolutely loved it. But everything changed on March 4th, which was about 4 years ago. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, okay, although I'm always an open book. So after today, if anyone wants to talk through or ask questions, I would love to tell you what you would like to know. But, that day became, it was a typical day, I got to school usually about 5 o'clock in the morning, just because, I had 2 little kids at home. My wife was staying at home at the time. She's now back teaching, but she was a teacher, stayed home, now she's back teaching. And so I would get there early, get some quiet work done before everybody showed up. So this day was no different. Beautiful spring day. It was a Friday. Everybody's excited. It's a Friday before spring break. But basically what happened that day is we had a kid come into the school day, came off the bus, went straight to her counselor and said, hey, I came off the bus and I was sitting behind these kids and they were talking about someone who has been bringing a gun to school. And this student was obviously distraught. She brought it straight to the counselor, which was great for her, see something, say something type of deal. And immediately that report came to myself and another assistant principal and interrupted our day, which was fine because we're used to incidents happening before the school day even starts, whether fights or emotions or sometimes, alcohol, drugs, not typically weapons, but this wasn't out of the, realm of possibilities. We started then interviewing the students that we could find. So as we talked to the counselor that had the information from the student, then we were able to get the 2 kids on the bus that she overheard talking about it. Then they didn't know much, but they led us to another couple other kids that we talked to. So we talked to about half a dozen kids. And no one really knew a name, but all had different pieces of like, well, yeah, we hear somebody's been bringing a gun to school. We finally, though, are able to get someone talking about a nickname of this kid. And usually you'd think like a nickname, that's like a 1 in a million straw pulling it out of a bag. But this nickname was pretty unique to the other assistant principal and I. This was a kid that was in a lot of conversations. This kid was in my alphabet. As 4 assistant principals serving 2,000 kids, we each kind of divide the alphabet, and those are our kids that we monitor academics, have discipline conversations, those things. And so as soon as we heard that nickname, we were pretty sure we knew exactly who this was. So we had to find him. We went searching for the student. We knew what class he was. We located him. And this was one of those moments in leadership where, although we knew this was very serious, we knew this could be very serious, we still didn't know, that it was fact, that he was guilty. And so due process was always and is always so important in any type of job, position, but especially in schools. If you have children, I bet you want to know every day that your kid's going to be treated fairly by the teacher, by the administrator, and that's how we operated. And so, but we also had that sense of urgency. Because I knew this kid, and because we had a good relationship, he was at risk. He was at risk of not graduating. He was credit deficient. Like I said, he'd been in some behavioral challenges that he and I worked together. But we had some pretty hard conversations together. And there was at least a little bit of trust. He would probably never have meant that he liked me. Not many kids who have some disciplinary issues would say they like their assistant principal. But we at least had enough of an understanding because we were trying to do everything we could to support him. But that's where relationship and strategy came into this. And although we were moving on the fly, we had to be very strategic, including I went into the wood shop class, found him, but didn't see his backpack. Therefore, I'm like, if the gun's somewhere, it's probably in a bag. And so talking to him at a very calm, normal, type of interaction of, hey, let's go talk about your academics. It wasn't unusual for me to pull him from class to talk about that. And hey, where's your laptop? Go and bring that. It's probably in your bag. So he brought his bag and his laptop. And I was able to safely get him out of the classroom. And the other assistant principal kind of tailed behind, kind of out of sight. But then he and I walked through the big commons area where there's probably about 3 dozen students who should have been in class, but we're hanging out there. And so also through my thoughts, even though on the top I'm trying to stay composed, on the inside I'm thinking about, okay, if there is a gun in the bag and we're walking and I'm at least on this side of him because the other side is a wall, what am I going to do? And you can't think of all the scenarios and you can't live in fear, right, in life. But at that time, and maybe you guys have been there too, where you can't help but just be aware of your surroundings, think through possibilities of what might happen, and I think that's okay. And that's what we were doing in this moment as we were walking, as I was just chatting him up a little bit, and we were trying to walk, amongst and through these students to get to the office. It was still on my mind of what would happen if he pulled out a gun right now. What would I do? So we finally get to the office. And again, I have some time to kill because the other assistant principal stepped out to do passing period, which we all know trying to keep 2,000 kids moving from point A to point B takes a little bit of supervision. And so I had him sit down. I had him pull out his laptop and talk me through, how his classes were going, show me his progress, and still kind of just maintaining that calm perception on the front while inside I'm thinking, okay, if this is legit, what's going to happen if all of a sudden something, he was very street smart. And so what would happen if all of a sudden he realized that the ruse was up and he takes out a gun? So things didn't really escalate significantly until the other assistant principal joined. It was the 3 of us sitting at the table. And again, still not trying to point a finger at him, trying to talk to him about like, oh yeah, and by the way, hey, the other assistant principal and I, we're working on something this morning, and while we have you here, because you're pretty popular, people know you around school, you know some stuff. Have you heard of anything about somebody having a gun at school? Just random, I know, but do you? And, he immediately said, no, I haven't heard anything. I said, hey, cool, no problem. I thought I'd ask, but no problem. But then I reminded him that, as we do investigations like this with things that could be unsafe to kids and or illegal, we need to make sure whoever we talk to, they're safe. And that's just kind of one of our policies. So even if it was one of your kids, great kid, had nothing to do with it, but somehow their name folded into this investigation, we would sit down, we'd explain, they say, I don't know anything. And we would probably search them too and follow up with the parent because that's just our obligation and expectation to make sure everyone's safe. But it was in that moment that he said, nah, man, you're not going to search me. And that's where, again, trying to stay calm, but it's starting to move a little bit. Under the table, I text the school resource officer, who we'd already given a heads up to. We'd already given a heads up to our principal what was going on. But I text him, I said, get in my office now. And so he arrives, he closes the door, he's standing there. And that's where I try to plead with the student one more time. Hey, let's not get him involved. Let's just do this and then get you back on your way. And that's where he just stood up. And I think like what some educators or parents would do, like you kind of sense something's coming to and you stand up as well, maybe close in proximity. And that's when I remember he took the backpack from around his back to his front. And that didn't really bother me too much because I had some students in my office that would do that to really like protect that vape, that they were like, you're not going to search me and find my vape. And so I said, okay, that's not really bothering me that much. But he reached down, he pulled out the gun. And that's where some things get foggy. And so we talk about mental health. There's such a connection between the physical body and the emotional body and the brain that in those probably 30 seconds, what I remember is loud gunfire, not being someone that's been around a lot of gunfire, just echoing loud gunfire of the student firing at the police officer, the police officer returning fire. And then me not really thinking, because I'm not a fighter, me and my younger brothers got into some things before we realized we were way too big and somebody's really going to get hurt. But the next thing I remember is being on top of the student, putting everything I have on top of him, pushing him down, My right hand was on his hand that was still clutching the gun, and I was prying it out of his hands to try to slide it away, while also doing everything I could, with exception to like do something I know that would hurt him, like choke him or something like that. And at the time, all I could think about was survival, but yet protection. Like, hey, this is like my body's just kind of acting on its own at that point. And so once that kind of, de-escalated, I got the gun, I kind of shoved it to the other assistant principal that was over in the corner of the office, and she had not been hit. I realized that I looked around and the school resource officer was on his radio. I could tell he had been hit a couple times. And now that the student was disarmed, I had kind of taken a breath and I realized that he was in pain. I realized I saw blood on his kind of abdomen, so he'd been shot in the gut. And then I also saw him vomiting. And so I immediately was able to kind of take a moment and get back into the mode of, okay, now I have to help this kid. And that's when, same thinking from the SRO, he said, hey, you need to turn him on his side because he's vomiting. And it was that time, as I'm kind of over the student still there, that I looked down, and in kind of like the corner of my hip on my pants, I see a hole. And it was, in my mind, and still today, it's a little comical, even though this is quite serious, but I'm almost like, what the hell? Like, I have a hole in my pants, and then I'm like, holy crap, I've been shot. And it was that time that the pain kind of started coming in, and the reality or shock or whatever might have been happening started flooding in. And so eventually, the rest of the story, the first responders came, they were able to get us all to the hospital, and then by the end of that night, I was home with my family. And so, fortunately, everyone walked away. What I tell myself continually, and I tell others, is whether everyone did that right, wrong, or indifferent, or perfect, in my mind, forever, it's the 1 out of a million shot that we were all able to walk away. Because there's policies, of course, we do crisis drills, we do active shooter drills, but no one really, even in my doctoral program, there's no really set of steps of what happens if you confront a kid and he pulls out a gun. And again, I don't mean to say that to alarm or scare anyone, but that's just the things we have to be prepared for sometimes, and we have to trust the relationships we have with others that we're working with. We have to trust our instincts. But that one moment changed everything. So I'll keep going a little fast here because I get behind sometimes. So what happened next after that is the spring break was after that, and then I didn't go back to work, obviously. My wound was healing. I had a bullet graze on my arm. And it was that first week after, so during spring break, that it finally hit me that I wasn't feeling right. And here I'd been this person that tried to work with counselors, tried to work with kids in the school setting to remind everyone of resources, remind others to ask for help. And although I probably, looking back, should have done better about asking for help instead of having sleepless nights and thinking through pissed off parents and teacher situations and stuff, it wasn't until this moment and these feelings, both emotionally and physically, that I was now feeling, that I realized something's not right. And so I called a dear friend who oversaw the counselors of the Olathe School District, and she immediately contacted someone at Johnson County Mental Health. And at the time, I believe she was either the director or the assistant director, showed up on my doorstep that evening and sat with me. And from there on, we were able to arrange some resources. I still see a trauma therapist now every month, month and a half, 2 months. But everything was different. Everything, even though I was home and off work technically and trying to take care of myself both physically and work through these new emotions and feelings, everything was different. And ironically, during this time, and actually before the shooting, as a family, we were starting to kind of feel like this was not a good fit. As I recall, I was working in a really unbalanced way. I thought I was doing just fine because I was providing for my family, but ironically, I was actually doing the complete opposite of that. Working long hours when I would get there early and then not get home till sometimes 10, 11, 12 after a football game, a basketball game. I wouldn't see my kids for like 2 or 3 days at a time. And so finally, talking to my wife, we said, man, this may not work out, and I don't know how to do it differently. And then the shooting happened, and so that also brought in a new space of, well, maybe we need a fresh start. my wife grew up in Wichita. I'm familiar with Wichita a lot. I grew up in Western Kansas, so we said, hey, maybe we need to find a new opportunity. Fortunately, there was a district athletic director job at that school district, which was another dream job of mine. I hadn't even thought through that I couldn't handle it in education anymore. I was like, this is still what I want to do. This is still important to me. And so we moved. And even though I continued to do therapy from afar virtually, even though I knew I was still feeling things that I wasn't sure of and I was trying to learn, but also trying to cope how I could, I did kind of the typical thing people might do. Surrounded myself with work, plugged myself in. I wanted to create relationships, meet people as you would when you join an organization. But that kind of started leading into, well, I'm fine. I'm fine. Hey, this is actually feeling good, fresh start. We built a house out there. This was going to kind of be our place. But I wasn't fine. And it didn't start making me lean into why I wasn't feeling fine until I started realizing that the belonging piece was not there. I wasn't just the new guy in a new organization, and some of you might relate to that and how that, that's hard. But it was way different in Wichita. And that's a great school district. They have a lot of challenges. It's a huge school district, but I didn't feel like I belonged. And ultimately, that combined with some other challenges and trying to figure out where the heck life is taking us, we just said, hey, pause, we gotta move back. If none of us are super happy, let's not try to force this to work. Let's not wait for 4 years. Let's just do it. So we moved way too many times during the world's worst time to move. But, I was exhausted mentally, emotionally, and physically, and I couldn't really put a finger on why I was feeling these things. I was learning more about anxiety and about depression. And it wasn't until we came back to Kansas City that I eventually got on medication that I'm still on now. And that was such a blessing. I feel like that finally allowed me to have the break I needed. And so, I know medicine works for some people and is maybe not something for other people, but for me, that was a game changer. So we moved back, and I find another education job on the Missouri side, and I keep going. And I'm like, okay, I can do this. I still love sports, but something just wasn't right. And it wasn't all mental or emotional. There was still a lack of belonging, which hurt, and it was hard to deal with. But now it wasn't the trauma from the crisis, because I still liked the juicy investigation. I was good at that. I was good at talking to parents and kids that made a bad mistake. But now it was the time that I was wasting being away from my family, the sports events that I once loved and was so proud of, being behind the scenes and seeing everybody in the stands, and realized to myself that I had something to do with that. But really it's all about coaches and the kids. I had lost that. I had lost all the passion because I wanted to be home. And that hurt me to my core. And so I left education, which was not an easy thing to do. And this was actually mid-year. And so further unique, especially for an administrator. I knew I was leaving them high and dry. I knew this was not going to be good for them, but I had to for my own, sanity, my own mental well-being, and for my family. And so this is important. You don't need a moment like mine. Mine's pretty unique, it's pretty intense, but we all have moments, and they all might be intense to ourselves, but we all have moments when you feel like you've lost yourself. And that's what I was experiencing, especially once I left education, because I left that last job without any job in hand. I just knew I couldn't do this anymore. And I kind of joked with my wife that I love coffee. And whenever I go to Starbucks, not as much now, but sometimes when I do, they're always so happy and cheery. So I'm like, dude, I want to work at Starbucks. If all else fails, if they'll have me, I wasn't even saying I could get a job there, but if they'll have me, I could work at Starbucks. My wife didn't think that was a good idea. So somewhere along that way, okay, I knew I couldn't keep living the same way. Okay, thank you. I knew I couldn't keep living the same way. I couldn't keep, figuring out how to do something that I love while also try to be the best dad and husband I could be. And so eventually I did have to find space to slow down. I did have to think about, well, what do I want to do and how do I want to show up in life? And at some point that was hard for me to kind of answer to myself, because if I wasn't a leader in schools, I didn't even feel like I was a leader anymore. And here I was this administrator, and I had my doctorate, and I was passionate, and even had some aspirations to maybe be a principal or a superintendent one day, and now it was all gone. And so I was like, well, what the heck is my direction now? I knew that over reflection and time, what's at my core is I want to serve people and I want to care for people. And that was non-negotiable. And that's why I think Starbucks popped in my head, because it's like, I would be happy, I could serve people. Yeah, literally. And so I had to be honest with myself, and I had to push aside this perfectionist that I had always been, this one that always tried to climb the ladder, that eventually got high and was like, okay, well, I'm up here, boy, this is not what I expected. But I had to face what I was avoiding, in that, man, this healing thing, this trauma thing, this is kind of how I refer to it. Trauma is going to be with me right here. This is my buddy trauma for the rest of life. And I'm okay with that. I've accepted that. Okay, it doesn't mean that trauma is going to defeat me. It doesn't mean that I wear a badge of shame. It just is what it is. And in fact, sometimes I see this as a little bit of a grateful, not opportunity, but a grateful new chapter, because it's allowed me to kind of see the person that I want to be the person I want to be, and now put me in a position where I can hopefully impact others through what we're doing right now. But healing, it sucks. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's slow, it's messy, it's one step forward, 20 steps back, and some days it's just not even knowing what the heck to do. But it is healing, and in taking the direction of taking it literally one step at a time, okay, you will make progress. And that's what I've found, and that's what I try to remind people, even in their darkest times, even in my darkest times. Even the days, I'll mention I was never suicidal, but in my darkest moments, and even when I had my first panic attack at the last education job, I always remembered to try and take at least what's right in front of me, even on those moments where I couldn't even see the next day. It was that intense and that crushing, where I couldn't say, man, I don't even know what tomorrow looks like, but I knew that I had to somehow get through it, and doing it at my own pace. So I started seeing things differently. And in fact, when the job I did find, the career of financial advising, now I see things differently in a way of not trying to, work as hard as everybody else or outwork them or be a perfectionist. I stick to what matters most. My wife, my 2 boys, me, and also helping and caring for others. And so that's why now the work I do is we talk about, I'll kind of get going here, is when we talk about how it is possible for you to put your all into your job and do meaningful work and be proud of that, while also take care of what matters most to you. That's what I found. And so, actually I skipped over that too. Everything that I was looking for, that I knew that I was missing, was right in front of me the whole time. My family, my mental health, being present, and overall feeling peace. And that was something that really I didn't think about too much in my life before the shooting, but now I think about every day. Brené Brown's book about the gift of imperfection was one of the best books I read, because she talked about living wholeheartedly. So if you can do work, you can be you, and at the end of the day, or several times throughout the day, you can say, hey, you know what? This is okay. I'm okay. I'm fulfilling what I want to do. That's what life is about, right? And so as we wrap up here, at some point, we all will find ourselves asking that question, what matters most? And if there's one thing that I can offer you as you leave today, after some other presentations, that think and reflect on that question a little bit more than maybe you already have. Truly, what does matter the most? Okay? And there's really, no wrong answers, but it allows you to think about your own life in that perspective. And again, you don't need an intense moment like mine. That's very unique. You guys, everybody has enough moments in life that kind of splits their life in before and after, or just traumatic events that happen. You could wake up on the wrong side of the bed. You could have an argument with that 11-year-old that may or may not happen in our house when I'm trying to get him up and he's dragging. And now it's like, gosh, the whole day is ruined. Everybody's in a bad mood. Okay, all of those things matter. But you have to be able to take care of yourself. For me, what began as a journey of rediscovery, and that's what I talk a lot about in my book of like, man, I'm not even a leader anymore. Like, what kind of man am I? What kind of husband? I've been a crappy dad. But it actually became about returning to what matters most. There's things before the shooting that are still in me right now. There's a lot of things of who I was before the shooting that have changed for the better. And so again, I'll go back to this. What truly matters in your life right now? Because as I've said, it wasn't clear to me right away, but when I started with small steps, when I tried to take the time it needed to focus on, well, how can I be happy in life? How can I be the best dad and the best husband I can be? Well, I found that for me, taking time to pause, protecting what matters most. In fact, another really great book that impacted me so much, I wear a couple wristbands that helps me physically cope. But the book by Mark Manson, The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F, amazing read. And that got me through a lot of bad times. Because it's basically saying like, dude, why are you spending your time worrying about something that you shouldn't worry about? Because then when you get to the moment that you really do have something to worry about or care about, you've given all your energy to stupid stuff. And so it was really impactful to me at the right time. And then making sure I'm prioritizing things in my life. All right, and this is the most important part today as we wrap up. You don't have to choose. I learned this and I'm offering this to you. You don't have to choose between doing meaningful work and taking care of yourself. Kaleb, 5 years ago, I don't even think I would have made sense of that, because my only direction and vision was to work, grind. That's what everybody said. They're like, oh yeah, that Kaleb, man, he will outwork anybody. And I wore that like a badge of honor. I was proud of that. But now looking back, man, I wasn't even close to doing it what I now know is the way that needs to be done. And to be able to make this happen, you just have to think through what truly matters, okay? And keep taking that next step, because you're going to have ups and downs. You're going to have traumatic events happen. Even if you haven't thought about, do I have trauma in my life? Things happen to everybody. Hope is always possible. Light will find its way in. And if you can remember that as you continue to go through things, I believe that you all will continue to thrive professionally at what you're doing, but you will also just continue to practice something very healthy that will come back 100-fold, both physically and emotionally, is thinking about what truly matters.